Good morning. This is Memorial Day. If you don't mind, I will indulge you with a little of my own experience that makes Memorial Day a time of very special meaning for me. Many of you know I've been in the military for these last almost 27 years. Part of that time was the deployment overseas, activated in defense of our country in a rather forsaken place in the world called Iraq. And spent some time there trying to be a pastor to soldiers who were there doing very, very difficult things over very long periods of time in an environment that is not easy to live in. I was there from the year 2004 to 2005, and much of my time, about half of that year I was there, I was at a forward operating base, a FOB if you please, called FOB Cal Sioux. And we were a few miles, 40 some odd miles from Baghdad, and it was a part of the country where we were not liked all that much. And FOB Cal Sioux had some experiences with incoming mortars and rockets almost on a daily basis. Usually just a few rounds, and then that would be it. But we got used to knowing how to duck. I lived in a tent, and surrounding that tent were sandbags, piled all the way up and around. And we just got used to the fact that there was going to be incoming for a period of time. We did okay, but there were a few times when things didn't turn out quite so well. One day, only a few short weeks from Memorial Day, 2004, a very short period of time, in the afternoon I was in my tent with my chaplain assistant, and explosions started sounding. And this time was different because those explosions were coming toward us. Apparently a mortar team had begun to send rounds to us, and they began to walk those mortar rounds into our area. And by the time they had finished 19, 20 rounds of mortar had landed in our area. And of course, when it started, I reached for my Kevlar helmet and my IBA chest protection and then I was going to duck down and get behind and underneath where the sandbags were. And before I could get everything off the shelf above my bunk, a little piece of mortar came through and scratched me on the neck. Well, I immediately went to the floor and put a handkerchief over and waited for the mortars to stop. Shortly after that, my assistant and I made it to the aid station. And while in the aid station, they brought in a soldier. And he didn't receive a scratch. The medics and the physician's assistant were working on him frantically. And as I was in the other room, I could hear them struggling to try to bring this soldier to resuscitate him. And they worked and worked, and the physician's assistant had never experienced someone dying under his hands. This was a first for him, and that soldier died. By the time the dust began to settle, there were 3 deaths in our area, and I had just received a scratch. I survived. They did not. Why? These were young men. They had a lot of life ahead of them. I was an old man. I'd lived quite a bit. Why was it that I continued to live while these young men, whose lives were really just beginning, were killed? One of those young men was part of my unit that I was there, and after a lot of turmoil in a few days, I I actually went to the hospital in Baghdad, and then after a lot of rough work on my part, they wanted to keep me there. I didn't want to stay there. I had to get back to my soldiers. But I got back to Bob Kalsu in time to do a memorial service for this young man. His name was Daniel Unger, 19 years old. And as I prepared the service for him, they brought some of his special effects, and among his special effects was a Bible. And in that Bible, he had marked a special passage in the book of Hebrews. And so in that service, I prepared my message based on the passage of Scripture that he had marked in his Bible. And we had a service for that young man. That was the first of several that I did while I was overseas in Iraq. But the thing that always haunts a soldier, or somebody who has been through a time of conflict, and he winds up, or she winds up being a survivor and others do not, is, why am I still alive and they're not? Memorial Day is a time when we think, why are we still here? When so many who had so much potential are not. How do we deal with that? And so that's what Memorial Day helps us to do. The scripture I want to look at is in the last chapter of the book of 1 Samuel and the first chapter of 2 Samuel. About three men, Saul, David, and Jonathan. Saul was anointed king of Israel. David had been anointed king of Israel. Jonathan was Saul's son. And David and Jonathan were extremely close to each other, like brothers. Saul was unique because he was the first king. And from the very beginning of his anointing by Samuel, he faced deadly battles. And any one of those battles could have ended his life and the lives of those he loved. Soon after he was anointed, in fact, he had to prove himself. And he did so in a very difficult conflict, but he led Israel to victory. And as a result, they proclaimed him king. He was able to reign for 42 years. And of those 42 years, he almost never took off his armor. Always there was some kind of conflict. Jonathan, his son, while still a young man, joined his father in the fields of battle. At one point, he and one other fought against and defeated 20 mighty soldiers, the Philistines. 10-1, tough odds. But he was a warrior, and he succeeded. David was anointed by Samuel when God had rejected Saul because of his disobedience. And he began his career as a warrior when, as a young man, he faced down and killed a Philistine champion by the name of Goliath. Again, facing death. And from that point on, David and Jonathan became what I would like to call warrior brothers. This is something unique as well for those who have been in conflict and you've watched each other's back. You have gotten to the point where if anyone's going to survive, we're going to help each other survive. And you become a band of brothers, warrior brothers. And David and Jonathan became this. They shared these day-to-day fear of losing their lives in battle. They vowed always they were going to watch each other's back. And they made painful sacrifices to preserve the life and the honor of their brother. They knew what it was, literally, to bleed together in battle. So they were well aware of what conflict was like. Now, for years, if you remember the story, David spent many years running as a fugitive, afraid for his life. He was threatened by the Philistines and the other enemies of Israel, but he was also threatened by Saul, who was jealous, because here's this young upstart who's been appointed and anointed by God to take my place. as Saul saw it. Time after time, David honored and spared Saul's life because Saul was the uniquely anointed king of Israel. In all of Israel, there were two individuals who had that special distinction of being anointed king, Saul and David. Very few in all of Israel, anointed by God for a special work. And David was never going to dishonor that special anointing, even though Saul was seeking to kill him at all times. It was heartbreaking because David longed to fight beside Jonathan. He wanted to be with his brother. But because of the fear of Saul, he could not. There had been a break in that close bond between these two warrior brothers. In the end, and that's what we want to focus on this morning, Saul and Jonathan faced their enemies alone, while David, who had hoped to be with them, he was commanded to go home. David's plan had been, well, if I can't really go to battle with them, I'll sneak in from the rear, pretending to be an ally to the Philistines. He was going to come at them from the rear and help his brothers in war. But he was not allowed to do that. David was left to mourn his beloved fellow warriors. He experienced survivor's guilt. But he turned that deep sorrow into a beautiful poem of remembrance. Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Pomona. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and pierce me through with it. Otherwise these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on him. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men that day together.